Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to our just after lunchtime webinar, Be Friendly, How We Can Support Pollinators at Home and on the CSU campus. I'm going to go over a couple of Zoom logistics before we get started. Everyone's video is off and everyone is muted. We ask that you stay muted just to eliminate distractions during this presentation. If you have questions, please feel free to use the chat box. I'll check that periodically throughout the presentation. If we get a lot of questions, we may not be able to answer them all, but we have our contact information and CSU Extension information at the end, so you know how to follow up with us. We will be recording this presentation and it will be posted on a couple of different websites, on the CSU Pollinator Committee on their website, and also the CSU Extension Cohorts blog. So we'll share that information at the end as well. And on that note, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Lisa Mason, and I'm the horticulture agent in Arapahoe County for Colorado State University Extension. So my job is to share science-based information, education, and research with everybody, with our local communities and anyone who's interested. I have a master's degree in entomology, but I have a special interest in pollinators. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about today. And I'm also co-presenting with Fred.
Fred Haberecht. My functional role at the Colorado State University is as the campus planner. I have a background in horticulture and in landscape architect. I'm a licensed landscape architect. And part of my role is to maximize the learning landscape opportunities of the university, and a pollinator rich environment on a college campus is one of those great learning landscape opportunities. Lisa, do you
want to unmute it?
Yeah. Oh, and I heard somebody is unmuted, so please do stay muted throughout this presentation. All right, so today we're going to talk about the Pollinator Friendly Campus Committee, and then we're going to dive into why pollinators are important and who they are. We're going to touch on wasps because that's a question that always comes up. And then we'll talk a little bit about beekeeping and developing pollinator habitats. So let's start with the Pollinator Friendly Campus Committee.
Thank you, Lisa. So in the spring of 2018, we believed that we could do better on campus, as did our President's Sustainability Commission. And so we initiated a committee that would be exclusive to pollinators. It has representation of facilities management, housing and dining services, EHS, our environmental health services, apiary club, our student government, local partners of the Gardens of Spring Creek, and then academic experts within the university. We have an active website that has resources, including the recording of this when we're done, and kind of tells what's going on campus. So that's kind of the genesis and the membership. Lisa? That representation of this committee is through the CSU Bee Campus USA. So it has requirements that we're happy to go along with, that create and implement pollinator-friendly habitat, incorporate pollinator-friendly gardens throughout campus, create engagement opportunities, post educational stories and signage. What we hope this is doing is, in some small part, piece by piece, transform campus into a better habitat for pollinators. And we're seeing some of that play out. That improved habitat is both in our creation of these pollinator gardens And then in the change of our current management practices, when and where we spray herbicides and pesticides, how we maintain the pollinator gardens over the winter, how much open space versus mulch we have to encourage overwintering. So it's both the creation of the habitat, management of that habitat, and then management of the overall campus landscape to encourage pollinators through our management practices. One example of the several pollinator gardens that have been instituted on campus is on the current slide. And as Lisa's going to talk about through her presentation, it is both a selection of plants for their ability to sustain pollinators, attract pollinators, and also through the season. So it's the right plant in the right place at the right time as well. And so this is an example of one of those beds that has been, it had always been a perennial bed, but the bed was re-envisioned with intent. And I think that's an important thing for both our college campus and for the homeowner. It is the creation and maintenance of these habitats with the intent of attracting and sustaining pollinators. That's where Lisa's going to come in, because we need science to realize that intent. If you're on campus, you have access to as a walking tour, and it's referenced on our pollinator-friendly website of major gardens that have been done with this intent. There is one right in the center of campus at the Clark building, where we have gotten some signage that's going in. You'll see in a subsequent slide. The previous slide showed one at the Weed Science building. We also have ones at our Gifford we redid the our sun deck area of the rec center, and then also as part of our VTH complex and as part of our housing complex. So although these are isolated today, we believe and small, they believe they're making an effort in transitioning campus, and we know that we're going to have more of these beds in the future. A little bit about the interpretation and outreach that we're doing with these signs. We received through ASCSU, our student government, funding to create some interpretive signage, which is really important on our campus. We've got lots of visitors. We have lots of content. Unfortunately, we do not have a lot of interpretation of what we're doing. So this is an attempt to have on-site interpretation of what we're doing, which would meet the goals of the university to try to educate the public and institute some of these improvements that we're seeing throughout the landscape, including a homeowner's landscape. And then lastly, besides promoting habitat, creating habitat, changing management practices, interpreting what we're doing on campus, we've also, in the last 4 years, improved our both response to honeybee swarms on campus. Historically, they had been removed immediatly. Now they're in a protocol that is integrated with our apiary club, so these swarms will have a home. And also introducing honeybee hives on campus, some of which we've been told has gone into some kind of beer at our own Ramskeller. So some of that honey. So it's the Apiary Club has established hives at the Durrell Center and then at our CSU Horticulture Center. And then it's an opportunity for that group to educate students about the proper beekeeping techniques and generally being good stewards for both the honeybees and pollinators in general. And Lisa, that is what the university has been up to. And is there any questions in chat or anybody with their hand up before we get into what you're going to talk about? Well, that's all well and good. That's the intent, but what does it take to create these habitats?
Okay, we do not have any questions yet in the chat box.
Okay, well then I think it's Lisa. Then let's go forth.
Okay, well, let's talk about who the pollinators are and why should we care? What's the big deal about pollinators? And before we focus on pollinators, think about big picture. Why do we care about insects in general? Well, the short answer is we can't live without insects. They affect so much of our lives that we don't even realize. So pollinators are responsible for facilitating plant reproduction that provides us with a lot of our food sources, but it's even bigger than that. And one great example that I always like to use are dung beetles and other decomposing insects. Without dung beetles, they really are the garbage cleanup crew in our ecosystems. We would still have buffalo patties from when the bison roamed the West if we didn't have dung beetles. Their food sources in a lot of other countries, their pest control. Our world would be overrun with aphids and caterpillars if we didn't have wasps and ladybugs. So insects really have a lot of important jobs that are behind the scenes that we don't even realize. So let's talk more about insects. And well, actually, before we dive into pollinators, insects and pollinators are declining all over the world, and most of it has to do with human activity. Urbanization is a big one, habitat loss, climate change, invasive species spread, and pesticide misuse are among some of the factors. And so let's focus specifically on pollinators and why they are so important to us. The short answer is they are responsible for about 1/3 of the world's crops are dependent on pollinators. So that translates mostly to our fruits, vegetables, and nuts, which is about 80 different crops. So those, the most nutritious part of our diets comes from pollinators and pollinating insects. That translates to about $15 billion worth of crops each year. So they're very important in our economy as well. And really, it goes beyond just our fruits and veggies. And one great example is pollinators are used to pollinate alfalfa and clover, and alfalfa and clover are used to feed cattle. So everything's all connected. And then when we think about our ecosystem specifically, about 3/4 of the plants, or 75% of all plants, need pollinators to be able to reproduce. So pollinators are really also the foundation for a lot of our ecosystems. And the honeybee is a wonderful, very efficient pollinator, but we need that biodiversity too. And one great reason for biodiversity is a lot of our pollinators have specialist relationships with their plants. And so the yucca plant, for instance, has to be pollinated by yucca moths. There's about 4 species of moths that can pollinate yucca plants, and one cannot survive without the other. We also, for human crops or human food sources, we need squash bees. So squash bees are very efficient pollinators of squash and pumpkins. Yes, honeybees will try to pollinate them, but the squash bees already have it done by like 4 in the morning before the honeybees even wake up. And you plant squash and pumpkin and they will come. So very efficient pollinators for pumpkins and squash. And then we have cactus bees. So cactus flowers, like in Colorado, we have prickly pear cactus, will attract a wide variety of insects. But in terms of efficiently pollinating cactus, oftentimes we need cactus bees. And then we have bumblebees. Bumblebees, besides honeybees, are one of the most common bees that we see. And they have a special technique that we call buzz pollination. So when they land on a plant, they have a special vibration that releases pollen from the plant. So they are experts at pollinating tomatoes, peppers, and blueberries. And while some tomatoes can self-pollinate, bumblebees are often used in greenhouse situations and other situations to really pollinate tomatoes and peppers efficiently. And so what is pollination? Pollination is basically facilitating plant reproduction. And the bees, they don't know that they're doing us a favor or the plants a favor. They are visiting the flowers for that pollen and nectar reward. And flowers and plants have evolved to attract those bees or other pollinating insects. Bright colors, a lot of times the flowers will have lines on them that sort of serves as a landing pad, like, come over here, this is a nice runway for you to land, and there will be pollen and nectar there for you. And so the bee lands on a flower, and most bees are very hairy, so the pollen grains are actually going to stick to the bee's body. And then she's going to visit another flower. And in that process, pollen grains are going to be transferred to the other flower and thus facilitating plant reproduction. And this is what happens when we don't have efficient pollination. So we don't end up with the ripe fruits that we are all very accustomed to. And so before we talk more about bees, I do want to give a big shout out to all of our non-bee pollinators. So let's walk through those real quick. Hummingbirds. So it's past April 15th. The hummingbirds are here. I've seen a few reports. They're migratory species. We have 4 species that we commonly see in Colorado. There are others, but 4 that are the most common. And they're going to visit red or orange tubular flowers, and they stick their beaks in, and you can see this female hummingbird right here. She's got pollen on her head. So hummingbirds are great pollinators, and if you have hummingbird feeders, now is the time to put them out. Wasps. Now we're going to talk more about wasps in a little bit. Most wasps are not pollinators, but there are some exceptions. And here's an example in the photo right here. These are called pollen wasps, and they specialize in a lot of penstemon flowers. So you can see they're in the penstemon flowers in this photo for the pollen and nectar. So there's always exceptions to every rule. Flies. Flies are also pollinators. And, most people are familiar with the common house flies that we see and that are sometimes a nuisance. But if you observe flowers, you're going to notice a lot of flies visiting your flowers. And they will definitely pollinate, and they will also provide pest control services. For instance, syrphid flies or flower flies are one of the most common visitors you'll see. And they are ferocious pest feeders on soft-bodied insects like aphids. So not only are these flies pollinating, but they're also, providing pest control. In this picture here is actually a bee fly. Bee flies are mostly not hairy, but like I said, there's always exceptions. And here we have a bee fly that is a type of fly that is very hairy. Butterflies. Butterflies are also can be pollinators and are wonderful additions to your garden. We have about 250 species here in Colorado that you may be able to observe. The trick, if you want to attract butterflies to your garden, you got to plant the caterpillar host food. So each species of butterfly has a different food source for their caterpillars. So for instance, this photo is of a monarch. Well, monarch butterflies, the caterpillars feed on milkweed. For two-tailed swallowtails, the big yellow butterflies we see, they host on ash trees and chokecherries. So every butterfly is a little bit different. And then we have beetles. Beetles are definitely pollinators, and you can see them visiting flowers, especially late in the season. Rabbit brush is a great example. Goldenrod, they're going for that nectar late in the season. And then we have moths. Some moths are pollinators. My favorite moth is pictured here. It's the white-lined sphinx moth, also known as a hummingbird moth. You'll see them a lot like at dusk, and they're going to pollinate white flowers that have long spurs. See the long spurs there on the columbine? That's perfect for attracting these moths. Now, the white-lined sphinx moth is a great pollinator, very common. Sometimes it's confused with the tomato hornworm, which we know tomato hornworms can be pests in your garden. They are totally separate. They're related, but the tomato hornworms feed on your tomato plants. The white-lined sphinx moth does not. So they are totally harmless and welcomes garden visitors. And then we have bats. So bats are pollinators. Specifically in Colorado, the species we have are insect eaters. We have about 18 species in Colorado. But if you go further south, one great example of bat pollination is the agave plant. So the agave plants have to be pollinated by bats. And if you appreciate a good margarita, you should thank your bats because agave is what tequila is made from. Okay, so now let's dive into a little bit more on bees. So we have a huge amount of bee diversity in our world and here in Colorado. In Colorado, we have over 900 species, and worldwide, we have over 20,000. And they are all sizes, shapes, and colors. So let's learn a little bit more about bee life cycles. There's 3 different types of life cycles that we're going to talk about. And the first one is our eusocial bees, our social bees. And we only have one species in Colorado that is social, and that is our honeybee. So honeybees are actually a non-native insect. They were introduced into the United States in the 1600s, and they are a managed and domesticated species. So they are not at risk of going extinct. We breed them. You can buy them, and that's how people raise honeybees. So honeybees have a fascinating, well, and all social insects have fascinating biology. But to be a social insect, there's 3 characteristics, and that means they have overlapping generations. So you have eggs, you've got larvae, you've got young bees that are caring for the larvae, you've got your foragers, you've got your drones, your queens, you've got different generations of bees within a colony. And then you have the reproductive division of labor. So within a colony, you have one queen, and she does all the egg laying. And it is the job of all the other bees to make sure that queen is taken care of. And you know, that colony is maintained. And then you have cooperative brood care. So when honeybees reach a certain age, they actually tend to the young bee larvae and will feed them and you know help raise them. So cooperative brood care is the 3rd characteristic that defines a social insect. So we've got our social insects. On the totally other end of the spectrum, we have solitary bees. Now, solitary bees are about 90% of all bees in our world. So 90% of the bees are solitary, and they have a vastly different life cycle. So the queen, or I'm sorry, not the queens, there's no queens with solitary bees. The adult bees will emerge in the spring and the summertime, and the females are going to collect pollen and nectar from flowers. She is going to go find a nest underground or in a cavity, and she's going to pack that pollen and nectar into a tight ball called bee bread. And then she's going to deposit one egg on that bee bread, and then she seals up her nest cell to protect it. And then she's going to do it all over again. And she'll lay a certain number of eggs, and all those eggs are going to overwinter. So the larva will hatch and will feed on the pollen and nectar. And that little baby bee has all the food it needs to become an adult bee. So they'll go through full metamorphosis and emerge the following year. So solitary bees, they really don't interact with any other bees unless they're mating, and they have a 1-year life cycle. So very different from our social bees. And then, oh, one more thing about solitary bees, 70% of them nest underground and 30% nest in cavities. So when you're in your garden or at the park or on a walk, if you see insect holes like this, a lot of people assume maybe they're ants or something else, but there's a whole variety of insects that will nest underground. So if you're really curious, I recommend just observing the holes and seeing if you see any visitors flying in and out. The other 30% of our solitary bees nest in cavities, so in tunnels. This is where bee hotels come in. Or some bees will actually nest in hollowed out twigs or any other crest or nook or cranny. For instance, I have a leaf cutter bee and she's built a nest in between 2 patio stones in my back porch. So they'll find any nook and cranny they can. So here's a couple of photos. So here's the bee bread and the larva, and then you've got the pupa right here. Okay, and then we have our primitively eusocial bees. So we talked about social bees, we talked about solitary bees. Right in the middle, we have primitively eusocial, and that is all of our bumblebees. So bumblebees have a unique life cycle because they are both social and solitary. So let's start with the queen. So it's midsummer, a new queen has just hatched, she's full grown, she leaves the nest and she's going to find some place to overwinter. Might be underground or in a pile of leaves, someplace where she can keep warm and hibernate as an adult. Once spring comes, she will wake up and she'll start to forage for pollen and nectar, and then she's going to find a place to build a nest. So a hollowed out cavity, maybe underground cavity, a wood pile, an old mouse nest, or sometimes where you'll find bumblebee colonies, and she'll start laying eggs. Throughout the summer, she'll have several generations of foraging bumblebees. And then about midsummer, she's going to start to lay eggs that are new queens and new males. And so the males and the queens will leave, they will find a mate. And then once winter comes, that current colony of several hundred bumblebees will die for the winter, but those newly mated queens will hibernate and the cycle will repeat itself the following summer. So characteristics of both solitary and social bees. And so unfortunately, I don't have time to go into a lot of identification real quick, but I do have a pop quiz for you. So one of the key things to identifying our native bees is to know, is it a bee, a fly, or a wasp? And they look so similar. So here's your pop quiz. So look at each photo and think to yourself, am I a bee, a fly, or a wasp? And then I'm going to give you the answers. And I'm typing the answer to a question in the chat box. The question was, what was the name of the wasp that likes penstemon? And they are called pollen wasps. Okay, does everybody have their answers? Here is the answer key. So the first 5 photos are actually all flies. Now let's talk about why. The 2 characteristics, so you know that they're a fly, are these big fly eyes. The eyes go to the top of the head almost, just huge eyes. Bees have smaller eyes that are positioned on the sides of their head. And the other characteristic that's really easy is the antennae. So flies have short, stubby antennae, where bees have long, often bent antennae. So flies, some of them are hairy, some are not. Flies mimic bees and wasps because bees and wasps are stinging insects. And if a fly looks like a stinging insect, predators will leave it alone. So it's a form of mimicry, very, very creative. So this photo in the bottom left-hand corner, I took that, I totally thought it was a bumblebee. But if you look closely, it's a bumblebee mimic. So it's got those huge fly eyes and you can't even see the antenna. Flies also only have one pair of wings, but that's hard to tell when they're visiting flowers. Let's talk about wasps. So wasps oftentimes have long, narrow bodies. They're all sizes, from small to this sand wasp in this picture right here. But long, narrow bodies, no hairs, long antenna, and on a lot of species, it looks like someone went to their waist and kind of pinched it. You can see a constriction. Both bees and wasps have that, but it's very apparent in wasps. So long, narrow bodies and no hairs. And bees, so I threw in a couple of trick questions for you. This bee right here is a wool carder bee, very common on lamb's ear. The females actually scrape the fuzz off lamb's ear, and she lines her nest with those. So you'll definitely have them on your lamb's ear, but if you look closely, she's got little hairs all over her body, and especially underneath her abdomen here. You can see her hair. And that's where she collects her pollen. On this bee on the furthest to the right, it's a trick question. This is a cuckoo bee. So this is one of the only kinds of bees that actually don't have hair. So cuckoo bees are parasite bees. So they will actually lay their eggs in another bee's nest and can sometimes be observed on flowers. But the important thing to know about bee identification is, where are their hairs? Do you see pollen on them? So those hairs are specialized for collecting pollen, and different bees will collect pollen in different places. So let's look at examples of bees here in Colorado. On each of these photos, look at all those hairs. Sometimes you can see the special pollen collecting hairs. They are often either on their hind legs, like this sunflower bee right here, or on the underside of their abdomen. Here's a leaf cutter bee. And she's got all that pollen on the underside of her abdomen. So all sizes. So this little bee, you can see she's got pollen grains on her hind legs. She is actually in a bindweed flower. So bees pollinate all kinds of flowers, for better or worse. But that's to give you her size. She was very tiny, all the way to, our bumblebees that, queen bumblebees can be almost an inch. So a huge variety of bees in our backyards and gardens. So let's talk a little bit about safety and stings, because a lot of people are afraid of bees because they can sting. But let's look at that a little bit closer. So over 90% of all insect stings are actually the western yellow jackets, which is this top photo right here. So everyone says, oh, I was stung by a bee, or there's a bee flying around me. Chances are it's actually a western yellow jacket. Honeybees don't want to sting you. They actually lose their life when they do sting you. So they sting at the last resort, or if they're accidentally stepped on. Wasps, like yellow jackets in particular, they can be aggressive sometimes, and they're scavengers. So if you have stinging insects flying around your barbecue, your picnic, trash cans, it is most likely a western yellow jacket. And wasps do have the ability to sting multiple times too. Now, when we think about our native bees, or even we have a huge amount of wasp diversity too, all of our solitary wasps, they either cannot sting you, or they will very rarely sting you. So you would have to pick it up and, kind of make it sting you, like a mason bee, for instance. You would really have to handle that bee to get a sting from it. And native bees don't have the same venom that wasps and honeybees have. So when you're thinking about planting flowers for pollinator habitats, planting flowers is actually very low risk activity for stings, because it's going to be the bees that visit the flowers. And, honeybees, they really don't want to sting you. So while we're on the topic of wasps, let's talk a little bit more about that, because I always get those questions. So yellow jackets, like I said, are definitely the biggest nuisance wasp we have. They're scavengers, and they're going to be all around human food sources. They also, since they are scavengers, when fall arrives and the temperatures start cooling down, they can be a little bit more aggressive because food is becoming more and more scarce. So, and the other tricky thing is they are underground nesters. So their nests are often very difficult to find. If you do find a yellow jacket nest underground, be very, very careful. They will get very aggressive if they feel like their nest is threatened. So if you find a yellow jacket nest and it's close to human activity, really the best thing to do is call a professional and have them eradicate the nest because if you tried like wasp spray, their nest is so well protected underground. Wasp sprays are often not very efficient at all. I see a question in the chat box. Are there any benefits to yellow jackets? Yes, they're scavengers, so they are part of the ecosystem cleanup crew. They feed on dead things, so like carrion, dead animals, and so they really do. They clean up our ecosystems. It's just unfortunate in urban settings. We have a perfect habitat for them, and they have been able to thrive. So they are a native species. They just do very, very well in urban settings. And then the second nuisance wasp that we have is the European paper wasp. So these are the wasps that are going to build these papery nests under your house eave or in your shed or any other dark locations, often around human infrastructure. It's important to note these wasps are actually not very aggressive compared to yellow jackets. The only time they get aggressive is if their nest is threatened. And so, if the nest is on like a 2-story building and it's away from human activity, you can leave it. It's not going to hurt anything. But if it is too close to human activity, it might be a good idea to remove that nest. One thing to note about both yellow jackets and paper wasps is they only have a 1-year life cycle. So once fall and winter comes, that nest, the workers are going to die and that nest will be abandoned. They don't return to the nest each year. So similar to like bumblebees, the queen's overwinter and she will begin building a new nest in the spring. Which brings me to one more point about yellow jackets. So if you use the wasp traps, they're the yellow tube wasp traps, put them out now because the queens are just now starting to emerge on warm days. And if you have those yellow jacket traps out now, maybe you'll catch a queen before she starts building a colony. If you wait till July, I mean, she's got several hundred individuals potentially in her colony already. So get those wasp traps out early. They do not attract honeybees, and they also don't work for paper wasps either. So keep that in mind. Okay, and it looks like we have a question about commercial wasp collector bags to get rid of them. Yeah, so wasp traps, read the label. So they're likely for yellow jackets and they do work and they can help. European paper wasps are invasive, but they feed on pest insects too. So they'll also feed on like butterfly larvae too. But like tomato hornworms, I don't know. When I was a kid, there were a lot more tomato hornworms around than there are now. And a lot of that is probably because of the European paper wasp. Okay, so let's switch gears. So we talked about wasps. Let's talk about beekeeping and the role of beekeeping in our community and in our ecosystem. So beekeeping can be a very rewarding hobby or activity. Honeybees are very efficient pollinators for a lot of crops and a lot of flowers. It takes 12 bees their entire lives to make 1 teaspoon of honey. So next time you put honey in your tea or coffee, you know that those bees worked really hard to make that honey. Beekeeping, a lot of beekeepers choose to sell their honey, and that's a great thing to do. If you do want to sell your honey, you do have to go through a cottage food safety training before you can sell. Beeswax, a lot of people make candles and beauty products with the beeswax. The honeybees provide great pollination services, and it's a rewarding and educational experience. So I have a hive. Beekeeping is very fascinating. But beekeeping is not necessarily the way to save the bees. So I'm going to come back to that. But if you're thinking about becoming a beekeeper, do note that there is a time commitment. You know, that hive needs regular maintenance, especially in the spring and in the summertime. Beekeeping is also kind of expensive. Just to get started can cost anywhere from about $500 to $1,000. And just to give you an example, a package of bees that you order from reputable honeybee breeders is about $125, $150. If you do choose to beekeep, there is a chance you probably will get stung during the process, which, you know, even if you wear safety equipment, there's always a chance. And, you know, beekeeping, as rewarding as it is, it can be frustrating too, because honeybees have a lot of challenges. Specifically here in Colorado, weather, we have huge temperature fluctuations. And then, of course, there's all the pests and diseases that you have to watch out for. So beekeeping, it's rewarding, but it also can be challenging. And so if you're considering becoming a beekeeper, you know, just check your local ordinances, make sure you're allowed to have hives. Like if you're in an HOA, or check the city ordinances, and you'll want to educate your neighbors that there's a hive nearby. And we always say put out a water source too. If you put a hive in your backyard and your neighbor has a hot tub, guess where all those bees are going to go get their water? And then, you know, your neighbor's going to call you and say, why are all these bees here? So, you know, you want to be able to make sure your bees have water, and follow good precautions, like storing all your equipment in a sealed container, things like that. So if you're interested in beekeeping, we recommend doing research, ask a lot of questions, and join a local bee club, because they are definitely helpful. And, you know, another question we get from people considering beekeeping is, can I just set up a hive and let it be? Let it, you know, nature do its thing. The short answer is no, you cannot do that, because honeybees are a non-native species. We have domesticated them. They are considered livestock under the Department of Agriculture. So they require, you know, just like having pets or livestock, they require care and ongoing maintenance. And by doing regular maintenance, you're going to prevent the spread of pests and diseases to other hives in the area. So it's really, being a good beekeeper benefits everybody. And then, you know, honeybees face their own challenges. So they're not at risk of going extinct because they're a domesticated species, but we do see colony losses anywhere from 30 to 60% each year. By far, the biggest reason for colony losses is varroa mites. Here's a varroa mite right here. And varroa mites are everywhere. And they're, you know, bees can get them from other bees. So they're the biggest challenge, and all beekeepers need to do mite checks monthly. And if they have mites, they do need to treat their hives. And again, that benefits you and your hive, but also your neighboring hives. And then, like I said, the weather, temperature fluctuations, and hives also can sometimes attract other critters too. So a lot of considerations in beekeeping. What about bee swarming? So we are approaching bee swarm season. And so bees will swarm when they have outgrown their hive. So it is too crowded. So they basically say, okay, we're going to take the queen and we're going to go find another home. Before they leave, they eat all the honey they can. So they're very full. And they're very docile. So that's the big thing. If you come across a bee swarm, they are not, you don't need to freak out, because they are not going to hurt you. They're very docile. They don't have a home to protect, and they're very full of honey. So if you see a swarm, don't panic. The best thing to do is call the swarm hotline, which is at the bottom of the screen. Yeah, bottom of the screen. And then, you know, if you're curious, I would watch the bee swarm. You know, they leave the hive and they basically, it's kind of like a cloud of bees, and then they collect to about a football sized shape. They will stay there for a day or two, and in the meantime, they have scout bees looking for new homes. And so eventually, you know, when the scout bees find a new home, that clump of bees is going to go take residence in a new home. But the beekeepers, that's a great opportunity for a beekeeper because they can collect the swarm and put it in their own hive. So swarms are very cool. This photo was taken at Hudson Gardens in Littleton. And I was going to tend to my hive, and I noticed all these bees flying around in the air. And there was just more and more, and we just watched them collect on this ash tree. It was very cool. So, is beekeeping the best way to save the bees? Short answer is no. In fact, having honeybees to save the bees is kind of similar to having chickens to save the birds. You know, having chickens isn't going to help, you know, bird populations. So it's very similar. Beekeeping is very rewarding, and there's great pollination services. But if you want to help all the pollinators and beekeeping isn't for you, there's other ways you can support the bees. So let's talk more about that. Okay, so planting pollinator habitat supports pollinators and all the beneficial insects. And they need everything that other wildlife and people need: food, water, shelter, and space. So let's talk about food. So if you're considering planting flowers, bees and all pollinators need a wide diversity of flowers. Each plant has a different nutritional profile and offers different nutritional benefits. So just having a variety of flowers helps a lot. And then bees need flowers all season long. So right now on warm days, honeybees are out foraging. They might be on some dandelions, it might be on some pasque flowers. They're looking for any early season flowers all the way through September and October. You know, those late season flowers like rabbit brush, they will forage on. So planting the different flowers based on when they bloom is very important. Avoid double flowers. So this is often when you're shopping at the garden store, you're going to want to avoid double flowers if you want to plant for pollinators. Now, a double flower is here, this pink flower right here. Basically, horticulturalists breed flowers so that they are big, bright, and beautiful. But in that process, they breed out the plant reproductive parts, the parts that produce pollen and nectar for the plants to reproduce. So they are bred out, and basically they become more petals. And so what you get a sterile plant, and it's low maintenance, it's beautiful, but it's not going to offer any services for pollinators or beneficial insects. So the best way you can tell if it's a double flower or not is look inside the flower. If you see the plant reproductive parts and pollen in the flower, you're probably good. If you don't, then it might be a double flower. So a great example, or one example, is roses. So there are some rose varieties that are double flowers. There are other rose varieties that the bees love. And then you have native rose varieties too. So do a little bit of research on your varieties and look for those plant reproductive parts. Native flowers. Native flowers are awesome for pollinators. They will often provide you other benefits like lower water bills and that kind of thing. Native flowers are great, but there's also a lot of great horticultural varieties that are good for pollinators too. Oh, here's another example of a double flower. So this little bumblebee, she's going to be very disappointed that there's going to be no pollen and nectar for her in that flower. So based on the type of pollinators you're interested in attracting, you can buy plants and plant flowers based on certain characteristics. So for instance, bees are generally attracted to bright white, yellow, or blue flowers. A lot of times they're tubular or they have a landing platform for those bees. Birds are attracted to red, orange, sometimes white flowers. And they're usually long and funnel shaped for those hummingbirds to be able to get inside the flowers. Butterflies are attracted to bright colors, so reds and purples, and they need either narrow tubes or plants with like a landing pad. So if you're familiar with yarrow is a good example. It's a native plant, and it's basically like a disc shape that the butterflies can land on. And then moths, they're nocturnal, moths and bats. So planting flowers that bloom at night that are usually white or very pale pink can attract moths and bats. So these are good general guidelines, and feel free to use them. Just be aware of the double flowers that we talked about. So not all white, yellow, and blue flowers will attract bees. So look for those plant reproductive parts. All right, and this gives you an idea of what bees see. They see slightly on a different wavelength that we do. So for instance, green is going to appear gray to a bee. So a green lawn looks like cement, really, to a bee, and doesn't offer any rewards for that bee. So this gives you an idea of what the bee is seeing. So let's look at pollinator habitat. So here we have green trees and green turf grass. Turf grass is great for pets and for recreating on. Turf can have a lot of benefits. If you're interested in planting pollinator habitat though, this doesn't do anything for pollinators. So this middle photo is getting a little bit better. It's got a good balance of flowers, but also the turf lawn that the homeowner wants. And then this picture to the right is a good example of a native plant perennial garden. So it's got columbines and yarrow and some other things. So it's very bright and colorful, and also offers a lot of things for pollinators. Other things that bees specifically need, they need bare soil. We talked about how they nest underground. So they need areas of bare soil and no mulch. So mulch offers a wide variety of benefits to the landscape. And so everything in moderation, right? So maybe you have some areas that you use mulch in your landscape, but maybe you leave some areas of bare soil for ground nesting bees. Cavity areas are also good. So if you've got a dead log or a bee hotel or things like that, that can provide tunnels for cavity nesting bees. Yeah, and like I said, so if the mulch is too deep, bees typically don't nest in the mulch. You can leave dead flower stems throughout the winter. So raspberries, sunflowers, spotted Joe pieweed. There's a lot of different plants that have hollow insides, hollow stems. So if you have some of those plants and you notice that the stems are plugged up, you can leave those throughout the winter. And so those cavity nesting bees can stay there and emerge in the spring. And also consider reducing your lawn area. Turf has a lot of great benefits, but if you've got areas of turf that you're not using and you're just watering it, maybe consider putting in a perennial bed instead. I like to talk about the concept of wildscaping. So mimicking nature, mimicking our ecosystems. Humans generally prefer clean, neat, well manicured landscapes. But you could have a perennial bed that's maybe just a little bit more messy that provides a lot of services for pollinators and other insects. And then a water source too. So bird baths are a great option. You can also get shallow dishes and put some river rocks in them, and that gives a nice landing place for bees and other insects to drink water. Butterfly habitat. So they need a lot of the same things, but like I mentioned before, each butterfly has a specific plant host. And so this is a two-tailed swallowtail. The caterpillars feed on ash trees and choke cherries. Well, if you're at all familiar with emerald ash borer, you know that a lot of our ash trees are going to go away unless they're being treated. So this is a great opportunity if you want a nice, low water, beautiful shrub to plant. Consider planting some native chokecherry to support two-tailed swallowtails. And they need shelter and water as well. So butterflies will nest or rest in trees, shrubs, and that kind of thing. And then hummingbirds. Hummingbirds need a lot of the same habitat requirements. They also feed on insects. So planting flowers that attract insects, that have as a nectar source is gonna be good for the hummingbirds too. If you have a feeder, a 4-to-1 ratio of water to sugar is good. And they will also, hang out in a variety of trees and shrubs too. So different layers in your landscape. Okay, I'm running close on time, so I just have a little bit left. Bee hotels. Bee hotels are a great option for cavity nesting bees. They're very, very minimal risk for stings. You would really have to pick up those mason bees and leafcutter bees if you want to get stung. So it's a great observation and education opportunity for the family. What I will say is there's a lot of great extension fact sheets out there. Here's one from Michigan State that talks about best practices in bee hotels. Because if you don't do a little bit of research and you use the bee hotel every single year, you could be harboring some pests and diseases that will actually hurt the bees. So looking at those best practices like replacing the tubes every year, or if it's a wood block, replacing that every year or every other year, things like that can go a long way. The tunnels that the bees nest in need to be at least 5 to 6 inches long. If they're too short, the bee is gonna lay eggs at a she's gonna lay more, I think it's male eggs versus female eggs. So she needs at least 6 inches to lay the same ratio of male to female eggs. So this is a great fact sheet if you're interested in bee houses or bee hotels. So how do you decide what's right for your backyard? Well, think about your goals. Do you want to support native pollinators? Are you looking to attract maybe butterflies or native bees? Think about what you want for your landscape, and that can help you decide. Maybe you're really interested in beekeeping and you take that up as a hobby. The best thing you can do for pollinators is plant more flowers, especially in our urban settings. So consider your overall big goals and reach out to your local extension office, because if you have questions about that, we're here to help. So find your local extension office. And if you're thinking about building pollinator habitats on a larger scale, maybe your school or a local church or anything like that, the extension is actually developing some habitat friendly maintenance guidelines. So it can be used on a homeowner level, but it could be used at any other scales too. And that's to encourage guidelines that work well in our landscape, that aren't too much of a hassle, but also go a long way to help pollinators. And so HOAs is another great example that can use these guidelines. So we address fertilizers, pruning, pest management, a whole bunch of different categories. And I'll give you an example. Here's the pruning section. So like avoiding pruning when it's bird nesting season, avoiding pruning while plants are flowering, little things like that maybe not everybody thinks about, but can go a long way to help support pollinators. So if you're interested in this, they aren't published yet, but there is a working document. So my colleague, Darren Davidson, she's the horticulture agent in Boulder County, can email you a copy if you are interested in that. Okay, and I got to give a plug for the Native Bee Watch Citizen Science Program. This is a citizen science program we're running through Extension. We give you all the training you need to observe bees on flowers, and you can observe bees in your backyard, at a community garden, pretty much anywhere that you're interested in. And we're collecting that data. When the pandemic hit last year, we created this to be a virtual program. So it is now open statewide. And again, we'll give you all the training. Trainings will be in late May. I'll post this website in the chat box so in case you're interested, and you can always email me with questions. So we keep learning. Here's some CSU Extension has some great fact sheets. This is also the Citizen Science Field Guide that teaches you more about identifying native bees. Oops, I have that in there twice. Oh, no, I don't. Okay. We've got CSU Extension fact sheets, and then these are two of my favorite books on bees and pollinator habitats. Okay, again, I'm with Colorado State University Extension. We have an office in almost every county. So get to know your local extension office. Our job is to provide science-based education in the community. If you're looking for horticultural services, we offer diagnostics. You've got a sick tree or a dried out lawn, or you're wondering what to plant to attract bees, contact your local extension office. We are here to help. And we also do public programs and presentations. So get to know us, send us an email. Thank you for listening. Here we have the Pollinator Friendly Campus Committee. If you're interested in more learning more about CSU's efforts. It's also CSU Earth Month, so more classes are posted on this website, and I can take any questions. Okay, I'm gonna look in the chat box. Okay, looks like compare nectar from natives versus cultivars for native bees. So there's not an easy answer for that because every plant is so different. What I will say, natives we know, are fabulous for pollinators. They've evolved with our native plants. So you can't go wrong with native plants. With cultivars, there's a lot of great cultivars out there. Not all cultivars are going to be the same. So what I would look at when you're at the garden store and if it's in an outdoor area, look and see what plants the bees are going to. You'll see bees visiting those flowers. A couple of my favorite cultivars that are non-natives are blue mist spirea. It's a great shrub. It'll be covered in bees. It offers a lot of nectar sources. And my other favorite perennial is called moon carrot. It's a plant select variety, so it's non-native, but it offers nectar for a wide variety of insects. So natives are great. Some cultivars are great too. So I'd suggest doing a little bit of research. Yes, there will be a link to watch this again later. I will share that link again in the chat box, and also Darren's email address for habitat friendly maintenance. Okay, is there an easy way to determine if a bee is a honeybee or a native bee? Well, you might want to take my citizen science training class because we go dive deep into that. The best thing to do is if you're looking at an insect, look and see if there are hairs on the insect's body. Let me show you a picture of a native bee real quick, or honeybee real quick. Okay, so here's a honeybee. So it's got hair on the thorax, it's got bent antennae, the hind legs are flat, and you're gonna see little balls of pollen and nectar. That's a good indicator that it's a honeybee. The abdomen doesn't appear quite as hairy. So that's kind of what your standard honeybee looks like. If you see any other insects with hairs and that are carrying pollen, it's probably a native bee. Okay, I'm going to post a couple of links. If there are any more questions, please post them in the chat box. And also, I want to share an evaluation with you. So please give me feedback on how this class was so we can improve for next time. So here's the evaluation. And Darren, if you're interested in habitat guidelines, grab that real quick. Here's Darren's email. So it's d@bouldercounty.org. And then here is a link if you're interested in the citizen science program. Okay. So here's a question. Some with emerald ash borer approaching and spreading throughout Colorado. Many homeowners, HOAs, cities, they are selecting their healthiest ash trees and they are treating them with different chemicals. And so most of these chemicals have to be applied through a certified arborist who is certified in safety practices and doing it correctly. There is one form of it's a imidacloprid that is available for sale for homeowner use. If you have a large ash tree, like greater than 15 inches in diameter, you need to hire a professional because the homeowner formula is just not strong enough. So there's a lot that goes into what treatments are for what ash trees. So the question that comes up a lot is, are these tree injections, are they dangerous for bees? Because they're widely used. And that's a complicated answer. But here's what we will say. So ash trees bloom very early on in the season. And they bloom when there's a lot of other pollen sources around. So in research that has been done by Dr. Cranshaw, looking at early season pollen sources, ash trees are very, very minimal. So they aren't collecting a lot of ash tree pollen. So that makes it safer to do tree injections. And also, they might be foraging on the ash trees before injections are applied. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. But the short answer is, bees really prefer to forage on a lot of other things before ash tree pollen. Okay, any other questions? Ooh, and I'm not going to say this right, bifenthrin or horticulture oils bad for pollinators? I would have to do research on those specifically. Look, so pesticide labels, the label is the law. Pesticides are, if you choose to apply them, they have to be followed explicitly per federal law. So if directions are followed and safety equipment is used and everything, it should pose minimal risk for bees and other insects. If you read the label, it'll tell you if it's toxic to insects. So it's very product dependent. One thing I will say about horticulture oils, they're used for a lot, or maybe I'm thinking horticultural soaps are used for like aphid control. If you've got aphids, oftentimes you can use a strong jet of water to hose down the aphid infestation, and they're soft-bodied insects, so it either kills the aphids or they fall from the plants and can't get back up. So I would say, depending on the challenge that you have, do some research, and in Extension, we are here to help you with that. We will provide you with all options and pros and cons for both. Okay, any last questions? I know we're a little bit over on time. Okay, well, thank you all so much. Please fill out the evaluation. We're so happy to be here and start off Arbor Day and Earth Week this week, and let us know if you need anything. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lisa.